So I'm delighted to welcome you all to another discussion with the Multi-Species Coronavirus Reading Group. It's a special day, in part because it's our 100th event. So we've done 100 Zoom rooms in the pandemic. We've had a lot of endurance, and it's also special because we're having two people come back. Jamie Lorimer and Christian Rutz have both discussed their work in the reading group before, and we've got two authors who are joining us for the first time, Adam Searle and Jonathan Turnbull. We've got 4 papers on the deck for discussion today, all broadly related to the Anthropause and also the anthropulse. COVID-19 lockdown allows researchers to quantify the effects of human activity on wildlife and nature, ecology, and evolution. A co-authored piece with Searle as the lead author after the Anthropause, another one led by Rutz, studying pauses and pulses in human mobility and their environmental impacts, and another paper by Searle, Turnbull and Lorimer, Anthropause environmentalisms, and this is forthcoming. It's about the self-isolating bird club in the UK. So it's a rich set of papers, and I think without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to the authors. I've got some questions queued up as usual. If anyone has some questions or comments, just raise your hand, type it in the chat, or just unmute yourself. So without further ado, I give it over to the group.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. We really appreciate the invite. I think I was going to start by just giving some, try and give a genealogy to this work, from where it came from and why, and describe how we came together and then what we're trying to do in the future by bringing this natural and social science approach together. And I'm sure that the other presenters can jump in with all the bits that I'm going to miss. So Adam and I started working together on themes relating to COVID-19, nature, lockdown, environmentalism, right at the start of the pandemic. And it was through a very kind of everyday event. We were on Zoom having a meeting about something else, and we couldn't locate where the sound of birds song was coming from. Was it in Barcelona where Adam was? Was it in Kiev where I was? Or was it somewhere else? And this instantly got us thinking about kind of digital technologies, nature, how people were interacting with local nature, digital natures, faraway natures during the intense period of lockdown. So inspired by that, we kind of searched for a series of case studies that would allow us to see what people were doing and ask them why, and ask them to what extent this was different or stood in place for the engagements that we're having with nature before lockdown started. And so we went to lots of virtual nature experiences. Like we went to the Chernobyl exclusion zone, which is where my PhD research is based, and where there was a virtual Airbnb experience with people feeding dogs. We looked at peregrine nest cams quite extensively and other live stream animal encounters that people were using to study and just interact with nature in the background while they were working, sometimes to kind of pass the time. And we went to several care farms in the US that were giving these online experiences to raise money, and actually making a lot more money than they did before the pandemic started. And then we found that through this, we found that a lot of new people were becoming engaged with nature during lockdown. And that kind of troubled some of the assumptions that we'd had with digital technologies serving to distance us from nature. We saw that actually during this period, digital technologies were kind of repurposed and refashioned to create convivial relationships that, you know, might have impacts that were previously unexpected. And then around this time, we became aware of the self-isolating bird club, which is what we worked on with Jamie, developing a large survey that looked at the members of this group to understand, you know, what, how did they find out about this group? What was it as a social space? How did the things that they were sharing there, learning about there, translate into kind of offline practices? And we also, around this time is when Christian published the paper on Anthropause. And we found this concept extremely generative, very interesting way for thinking about geographical concepts like space-time decompression and the great acceleration, and this idea of pausing what in the pause or through the act of pausing, how did that reconfigure human-nature relationships? And so the Self-Isolating Bird Club served as a case study for thinking through that in more detail. And then we got kind of in touch with Christian at this point, when we'd already kind of done a lot of this empirical work. We did a survey and some focus groups, and we kind of wanted to come together with Christian to really explore this concept of anthropause and then later anthropulse together as a way of kind of helping to realize some of the conservation and environmentalist benefits that Christian's data pointed to, how to kind of make some of that palatable to publics by understanding, you know, why people had a lived, like what the lived experience of pausing was and the lived experience of connecting with nature was during that period, rather than just a kind of mechanistic understanding of what happened to nature out there and why. We kind of want to bring these perspectives together to unpack the anthro in the anthropause, and as a means of kind of helping that those insights of the conservation biologists and natural scientists or life scientists palatable to publics and for policy impact. Yeah, so that's kind of where we were moving towards. There's some other things on the agenda that we're hoping to unpack together, which hopefully some of the other people can discuss and we'll get to with questions. But that's kind of a genealogy of what led to the several papers that you've read today.
Thanks so much. I think that helps lay some of the key issues on the table. Christian, do you have any opening thoughts as well? I've got some questions that I can jump in and ask.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Johnny, that was a really good introduction. And it's a collaboration I'm really excited about, because I spent the last 2 years together with colleagues from my community, crunching data, trying to make sense of what happened to wild animals during this anthropause and subsequently. But we realized that feeding the empirical insights we get from those analyses back into effective policy making and recommendations to the general public as we emerge from the pandemic is a real challenge, and it requires an understanding of the human experience of this major perturbation that happened over the last 2 years. And that is something we are lacking in our community. And so I was really excited when Johnny's and Adam's and Jamie's paper came out, and we started discussing these things, and we realized that we basically have two parts which we need to bolt together to make sense of the enormity of what has just happened, but also to then use those insights to inspire effective conservation action. And I think it's quite interesting. I can only speak for the life science community that this is something that has been largely overlooked. So many people in my field think that analyzing the data is enough, describing the patterns, describing how nature responded. But I've certainly come to realize through discussion with social scientists that it isn't enough. And so I'm really excited about this dialogue and collaboration. And over the last few weeks, I started feeling a real sense of urgency for this dialogue to advance, because we are making good progress with our analyses. So as you may remember, I helped launch a global research consortium called the COVID-19 Biologging Initiative, which uses specifically animal tracking data. So think about Fitbits for animals, tiny little devices which are attached to wild animals to find out where they go and what they're up to when we can't observe them. Tens of thousands of these are being deployed every year as part of routine research and conservation projects. And tens of thousands had been deployed prior to the pandemic without knowing what was about to unfold. And we tapped this data goldmine, and we are now analyzing data on animal movements and activity patterns from before, during, and after lockdowns to find out how wildlife responds to these drastic changes in human mobility. And we have first results, and so do many other consortia that look at different kinds of metrics. There are working groups that look at environmental responses more generally, so looking beyond animals, looking at pollution levels and so on. And so all these big global research consortia are now at the stage where these data sets have been harmonized, are being analyzed, and where we have first glimpses of these of answers to these big questions. So what happened to nature? And I feel quite strongly that thinking about how to present this evidence to the general public shouldn't be an afterthought. Like, we need to prepare for how to feed this knowledge into policymaking processes and how to communicate it to the public at large. And so I feel, yeah, we need to make good progress with this over the next few months to really, yeah, as people have said in the past, learn the lessons that can be learned. People have said, well, you know, there are important lessons to be learned about human wildlife and human environment interactions. To learn those lessons, they need to be communicated effectively. And that's exactly what has brought us together. And I think what we are excited about at the moment, and what we would really enjoy discussing with you today and have some input on.
Thank you. So I've got one broad question that really any member of the team could answer, and also Christian too. So one of the phrases you have in your paper, Christian, is about the anatomy of the anthropause. You also talk about the anthropulse, and the early paper by the other team talks about the anthroportal that this might become. And in thinking about, I'm noticing, like, in these papers, I'm seeing different accounts of the anatomy. You know, on the one hand, gender, ethnicity, age, class, other sociological variables relating to how people move through space. There's the animal tracking data you have. There's a lot of material in both papers about sort of digital technologies. But I'm also wondering if transportation and mobility technologies are also part of the anatomy, both of the pulse and the pause, as well as the portal. So really, it's just a broad question that is an invitation for anyone to really talk about what you've observed about these different processes.
Just for clarity, Evan, when you say anatomy, you mean the sort of characteristics of the phenomenon, both in terms of how it's affecting different groups of people in different places, but also the drivers that are characteristic of this, if you like, decompression and acceleration that are going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually Christian's phrase, so I'm sort of taking it in a little bit and expanding it, but yeah, I think that's broadly the sense I was trying to use it.
Yeah, so what I meant by that, maybe Jamie, I can clarify, and then you can respond to that. So I was grappling with what the right term for this is, and what I mean is that if we define the anthropause as a global scale major reduction in human mobility, and we don't talk about the drivers or the consequences of that. And that is something I tried to clarify in this recent paper. So from a scientific point of view, it's helpful to just say our metric here is human mobility, and that includes people and their vehicles. And those mobility levels can fluctuate, they can go up and down. And then sometimes there can be major reductions, as we've seen during the pandemic, or there could be spikes, as we may see coming out of the pandemic. So if that is our sole metric, we can ask, well, when have mobility levels dropped sufficiently to deserve that label anthropause? For how long did that reduction last? When did they recover? How did they recover? And even you asked about, you know, human mobility data. So we've reached out to human geographers who mine, for example, cell phone data, mobile phone data, and who look very precisely at where humans move and what their movement patterns are, or traffic flow data. And those are metrics that are accessible to empirical investigation. We can ask, by what percentage have those levels changed? One thing we find is when we look at those data that following the hard lockdowns in April 2020, which lasted for a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, everything was well synchronized around the world. Things very quickly started disintegrating and becoming much more diffuse. And that is because different governments started imposing different movement restrictions, but it's also because compliance levels changed. We definitely see a signal in the data that suggests lockdown fatigue. So in some areas, lockdowns were still imposed, but the cell phone data tell us that people started moving nonetheless. And so what I try to get at is nobody really has pulled together the data globally, actual hard human mobility data globally, to document what this looked like around the planet. There are detailed local analyses for India, China, for Europe, parts of North America. But what we need is a global picture, and we've just started a collaboration where we try to do exactly that, and that's together with scientists at NASA, where we try to use one particular metric, and we try to paint this global picture. And it's really important to emphasize that this doesn't ask any questions about what drives those responses. It doesn't document the demographic subtleties of those responses. And it is completely silent on the issue of whether those changes have positive or negative effects on the environment. Those are all separate questions, and those are all questions we need help with through collaboration, because we can't tackle them.
So maybe just to pick up where Christian left off there. So those latter questions are definitely questions that we as social scientists have become more interested in. So if we separate those into two types of question, one is to unpack the anthro of the anthropause and the anthropulse, to think about the forms of difference that, if you like, species level classification subsumes. And as we know, the pandemic was experienced very differently by different groups of people, according to some quite familiar sociological criteria of race and gender and socioeconomic status, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a social science piece of work to be done there, but also, in particular, we were interested in what, if any, transformative effect the experience of pausing might have on people's sensibilities towards the environment. And for that, we needed to have a more qualitative understanding of movement. And so we turned away from an understanding of movement just as bodies shifting in Cartesian space to think about the concept of mobility, which is much more interested in the lived experience of movement and a lack of movement, and to look at how differential experiences of movement or a lack of movement might or might not lead to a shifting environmental sensibility. And that was where this work on the self-isolating bird club allowed us to get right into the lived experience of pausing, the lived experience of being in some ways locked in, but then having worlds open through digital technology. So there's quite a lot of components to this research project. There's a natural science piece, there's a quantitative social science piece, and then there's this qualitative social science piece as well, that are all emerging.
Thanks. So the floor is open. I've got additional questions if no one else wants to speak. Adam, do you have anything that you want to add?
I would just say as well that another thing that this frame of mobility has allowed us to think about was the role that digital technologies and communication technologies played in people's experience of space and time. That there was a kind of networked topology of connectivity that's kind of overlooked by looking solely at movement. That there were a whole range of more than human relations that were coming out of the pandemic via the use of these technologies, which was this frame we were bringing into it in the forthcoming article you had the chance to look at.
Some of the other things that I thought were interesting from this forthcoming article is just about kind of the different sensibilities and affects that played out. You know, it's not like a homogeneous experience of the Anthropause. Waiting, suspension, anxiety, boredom. So I was wondering if you could just talk about those subjective experiences, and also, you know, this idea of the portal hasn't really been unraveled yet, and I would love to hear. We've talked a little bit around, you know, pausing and pulsing, but how might we understand the portal idea that was proposed in the initial paper?
I think that's yours, Johnny.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I mean, in the very end of this conclusion, you'll see we say a portal or a springboard out of the pandemic, and I think that was kind of the portal almost suggests kind of, you know, this is something that's, there's two worlds and you're stepping through one and into another. But with the springboard, we were like, well, there's some aspects here of environmentalism that might actually be retained and kept and kind of brought through the portal, and that's why we use the term springboard to like kind of like signal that we're taking it with us. It's like bouncing forward rather than just passing into a new world. And I think the version that you've read of this paper, I think we've made a few tweaks to the conclusion to put some more solid ideas around what can be done or what can be learned by certain groups like conservation biologists, conservationists, environmentalists. What are the things that they could do? That what are the lessons that we learned from this period, and how might they inform future environmentalisms? And I think with you mentioned like the different affects of loneliness and boredom and anxiety, or all of these different things that were somehow associated with slowing down or pausing. And I think it was like what brought all of those affects out was the initial act to pause, to slow down. And I think that's what was the most important thing. The thing that was most important for us was looking at how these relationships were kind of changed for several different reasons. Some people to cope with grief or loss, some people purely out of boredom, some people because they'd always wanted to do this but had never had the chance. And it was really that pause that underpinned all of these different reasons. And in kind of forwarding the pause against the idea of a constant speeding up of society, against the idea of great acceleration, that is another way of gleaning lessons from this period that might be used to slow down a return to normality. And this is when the pulse comes in. So what parts of the pause can we ensure are, you know, brought into pulse life? Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. Sevgi, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Quite interesting discussions. I would like to ask you, your commentary piece, you examine three vernacular ecologies. I'm wondering what we could consider. It was domestic pet keeping, garden ecologies, and digital human encounters. What would be other vernacular ecologies that would be much more attentive to the gender experiences and experiences of the particularly marginalized or disadvantaged communities? What would you consider other vernacular experiences that you can examine more in the future studies? Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, because you are three male writers and photos are from males and your commenters are males as well. I'm just wondering how you would attend the gender aspect of it. Thank you.
So while we were doing work on the Self-Isolating Bird Club with Jamie actually got a student in Oxford who became really interested in the Self-Isolating Bird Club as well. He was really interested in feminist digital ecologies and gendered experiences of online space. And so Jamie asked Adam and I to supervise the student. And so we've developed a project on exactly that. So we've got kind of a side stream of the Self-Isolating Bird Club work, which is all about gendered experiences of online space. And there's some really interesting conclusions there. So the student's currently writing it up as a, she's called Naomi. She's currently writing it up as a undergraduate dissertation, but we're hoping to turn it into a paper as well. So there was, you know, we have looked at gender in these same vernacular spaces as we talk about in that first Anthropause paper. But I would probably suggest that we can look at certain you know, things around the domestic that people were able to pose or not in certain ways. So for example, I just think of like my own family, and I know that looking through the window into the back garden was done a lot more by my mum, whereas my dad was much more likely to have done those things on a walk. And so I guess like in that kind of traditional gender roles, I wonder that's another space in which we could look. So how did they get exacerbated or not during the pandemic? And to what effect? Did they get recalibrated or not? And how did people kind of consciously engage with those things? But yeah, I mean, the main way is through the Self-Isolating Bird Club itself. We'd kind of started unpacking the gendered aspects of bird watching and whether those had been recalibrated online, and actually found in this group that they significantly were, for several reasons, several positive reasons, which is good, but that's still in the pipeline.
So yeah, Naomi's work kind of traced a genealogy of the gendered nature of bird watching particularly, and how this often involved this very masculinist notion of going out there to the field to see some sort of external nature that was in a way exotic. And yeah, so she looked at how the practice of bird watching online had altered this idea of what counts as a meaningful relation, or as a meaningful encounter with an animal. And that was something that she found had been altered very much by the kind of back garden aspect of everything that was going on, that didn't involve this this requirement to go out somewhere external to encounter this very masculine notion of nature.
Thanks both. Christian, I noticed you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to respond briefly to something Johnny had said, like when he commented on the Anthroportal, like using this as a springboard moving forward. This was precisely the motivation of our group that looks at these animal tracking data. I mean, I think I explained during our first meeting last year that of course we realized that this was a major human tragedy, but we as researchers felt we had to contribute to learning the lessons that can be learned. And so we realized that there was an opportunity for us to try and make contributions towards understanding human-wildlife interactions that can be used to push for positive change post-pandemic. That was the vision of our work, and still remains the ultimate goal. We want to understand better how human activity on the planet affects wildlife, and we want to use those insights to guide conservation efforts. But what we hadn't thought through at the time is that the humans whom we will address with our conservation and management recommendations, once the empirical analyses, the statistical analyses have been completed, they have changed as a result of experiencing the Anthropause themselves. So the people we try to address with those recommendations have had their personal experiences that may have altered the way they respond to policy change or recommendations, and that is something, yeah, I'm really keen to think through a bit more, because we really want to maximize the conservation impact of this work, but that requires understanding the lived experience of what has just happened. I just wanted to take one step back and explain exactly what we hope to dissociate with our analyses. There's a long-standing interest in finding out how human activity or human disturbance affects wildlife. But there are different components to what humans do in the natural environment. There's us moving around as people. There is our motorized vehicles, our cars and planes and ships that move across the oceans and the landscapes. But then there is also infrastructure we put in the environment. It's our roads and buildings and electricity pylons. And there's good empirical evidence to show that all of these components affect the way animals use habitats, how they move across the landscape, how they use resources. So it's incredibly difficult to disentangle which of these components of human activity have the most severe impacts on wildlife. But what happened during the Anthropause is that some of these components were drastically reduced, but others remained. So what was reduced was like the presence of humans in the environment and the traffic levels, like car traffic, plane traffic, shipping traffic, were drastically reduced. And that allows us to disentangle these effects that are normally completely confounded. And so what our analyses look at specifically is what is the effect of us humans and our vehicles moving across the environment? And we get clear answers to that. And those answers will inspire conservation recommendations. And to give a practical example, we may find that restructuring the topography of our transport networks may be a good way, or changing the activity in traffic flow may benefit certain animal species. So those are clear recommendations we may be able to produce in a few months' time, but we need to communicate those to humans. Humans are the recipients of these insights, right? And so if you say, well, it would be good if you didn't use your car at this time of day, because that would really help these species in this particular area, we must ensure that those people are able and willing to engage with those recommendations. And that's the connection we as life scientists or environmental scientists are lacking. We don't have that insight and those data.
Frederic, go ahead.
Thanks. This is an extremely interesting work. I have more remarks than questions. I was thinking that the concept of the Anthropause was a useful way to move around debates on the Anthropocene on one side, like as if we entered the idea that we enter a time when humans have impacted the globe, and on the other side, the post-human vision of the world as there's a disaster and animals survive humans. So these are two views of a disastrous world, whereas the Anthropause is much more temporal and cyclical. And I was interested by your idea that we could anticipate the next phase of the cycle with this idea of anthropulse, and we can prepare for its consequences. I was maybe just wondering, because I've looked at how biologists and ornithologists prepare for a disaster coming from influenza pandemic. They use the concept of sentinel, which is the idea that we can read in the bodies of birds disease that will affect humans, but here and the sentinel is linked to the idea of a disaster that will come, but here it seems that you use more the idea of indicator, so measuring the number of animals. So is it a relevant distinction in sentinels for disaster and indicators for kind of cyclical return?
I can quickly respond to that. So this is a really important point, and it's something I started discussing with my colleagues how we can prepare for this. The main point I try to make is that when the lockdowns hit in early 2020, the research community and nobody else was prepared for that. And so we and many other researchers scrambled to form these consortia that would try and collate data sets, try and make sense of what just happened. And I realized when I wrote this piece, trying to clarify some of the conceptual points about the Anthropause, that the actual reverse might happen. So us emerging from the pandemic, many people may feel a need to catch up with travel, seeing friends, doing work travel, and that may lead to a temporary spike in human mobility. And I thought, from a purely experimental point of view, this is extremely valuable for us, because if we see that reductions in human mobility have certain effects on the environment and wild animals, and we infer causal links, then we can test those if the experimental intervention is reversed and human mobility now spikes. We would expect nature or wildlife to respond in the opposite direction. And that's when the penny dropped, and I realized, well, this time we can be prepared. I mean, there is no excuse to scramble in a few months' time and try to make sure that we have all the data sharing infrastructure, that we have our measurement instruments in place. I think we should now do the groundwork to be ready if and when it happens. I personally very much hope it won't happen, because there will be significant environmental costs to such potential spikes in human mobility. But if they do happen, we simply cannot afford to miss the opportunity to measure how nature responds to this reversal.
Jamie, go ahead.
I mean, just to come in on that from, I guess, more of a social science perspective, and nice to see you, Fred, and I enjoyed your work on sentinels. And one of the interesting things was about, I guess, how the experience of pausing recalibrated people's sensory apparatus, almost. That we started looking, and in the process of looking, we noticed things that we didn't notice before. And so if you remember, there was that meme that went around of animals taking over cities, and suddenly, every city had its wildlife on display, and there was a sort of version of that. This is, nature is healing, we are the virus, and the animals are taking back control. And then transpired they were there all along, and just we hadn't been looking for them, and now we started looking for them. They became visible, and so I guess that the process through which, particularly in the spaces of wildlife where there's a great dependence on citizen science and observation, that comes out not through government organized surveillance programs, but a much more vernacular way in which rumors travel, knowledge becomes visible, things go viral on social media. There was, I guess, a different sort of, if we'd like, sort of sentinels of sentiment that became, visible in the online spaces that were then harnessed by some to draw attention to various phenomena. And that was interesting, I think, in a much less scientific way, the ways in which various kind of affective energies caught up around particular species. In Britain, we got very excited about these goats. These goats became very visible in this city in Wales, and somehow the goats became a sort of icon of the sort of COVID Anthropause experience in the UK.
Christian, go ahead.
Yeah, I've got another thought on the sentinel idea. So with regards to this possible pulse in human mobility following the pandemic, I think the indicators we'll be looking for is number of flights, number of cars, number of people carrying cell phones. So very simple human mobility metrics. But this idea of using animals as sentinels of what's happening in the environment is something my community is very interested in. And by my community, I mean people who use these advanced electronic tracking devices that are attached to wild animals. And originally that work was mainly to find out what these animals do when we can't observe them. So think about migratory birds, crossing continents, we can't follow them. Think about deep diving whales, we can't see what they do once they start diving. So that's what inspired these technologies. But researchers have learned over the past few years that animals are very good. They are excellent at picking up environmental cues and picking up on things that are not quite right. And so there is an interest in using animal responses as early warning signs of environmental disasters. So colleagues of mine, for example, use this approach to have a pre-warning system for volcanic eruptions or earthquakes. And the idea is that animals may pick up on these events before they actually happen. And if you have these tracking devices on the animals, using sophisticated machine learning algorithms that digest these data in real time, you may be able to predict an eruption or an earthquake. So there is this idea of biological Earth observation that effectively uses tagged animals as sentinels. And the idea is that they have much better biosensors than any machine we can build.
Rachel, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us. Yeah, I wanted to just say that, extend some of what Jamie was saying a few moments ago, and kind of say the thing that really stuck out to me about this that I appreciate is just how much this kind of disrupts some of the more the representations in popular imagination around pause. You know, thinking about how the city of Milan sort of framed in the early pandemic, they were doing these aerial shots of the city as sort of empty, and this narrative around empty without humans kind of speaks a little bit to what Jamie was just saying about, well, you know, non-humans were there all along, and, you know, people are maybe noticing differently. It sort of disrupts some of the different ways that people were speaking about pause as sort of nostalgia only for human or human experiences and interactions, and shift some of this you know, the different ways of seeing or different ways of experiencing, or the beings that are there and always were. So I really appreciate that about this clustering of papers that you shared. But the other thing I wanted to ask has to do with, I think it was in the second paper that was led by Christian. There were points in the paper where you were actually sort of making, you know, strong urgings and suggestions to colleagues, you know, in your field, sort of saying about, I'm going from memory here, but, you know, things like, you know, gaining proper permissions or working to do some of the things that maybe folks have not had to do in their approach and to their research as yet. And I'm just so curious if you could say a bit more about that. Has this experience, this research maybe shifted the different ways of that scientists are now interacting with their communities to accomplish their work? And also, I mean, there's a huge kind of ongoing debate at UCLA about this, you know, some scientists sort of saying, I was actually trained to not, you know, I don't want, you know, or I was trained not to sort of have my research represented in certain forums, or to have my research kind of be you know, made accessible in the following ways. And so in some ways it raises a question about curricular shifts as well. How are we potentially training scientists to do their work, or do their work in different ways in light of these interdisciplinary conversations and bridges that you're building here? So I'll leave that there.
I can quickly take that. Thanks, Rachel. It's a really good point. And the short answer is it's fundamentally changed how certainly my community interacts and works together. I mean, it was really inspiring to see how this animal tracking or biologging research community pulled together when there was an opportunity to gain these deep insights into big questions by pooling and sharing data. And remember, all those data sets that have been shared with us were collected with funding individual research groups had obtained. You know, they had put in the money, they had put in the hours to put the tags on the animals. Then the lockdowns happened, nobody saw that coming. And when we put out a call for collaboration, we got overwhelmed by responses where people said, yeah, you can have my data. You know, this is for something that is much bigger than, you know, what we were planning to do with our study. And so, yeah, I think coming out of the pandemic, there will be a legacy of this. And I think people have come much closer together. There is a greater willingness to share data, to collaborate. And we are really keen to preserve that. I mean, we've come together in a period of crisis, but we've learned how much collaboration adds to the work we are doing if we are pulling things together. And as in almost any other field of scientific research, some of the biggest challenges will have to be tackled by big data science, and that means pooling resources, pooling data sets. Just as a little statistic, by the latest count, we've now surpassed 1 billion GPS fixes for over 13,000 tagged animals across 130 different species from all around the world. No single research group could ever do this, but it was because all these individual teams pulled together and realized that this is the right thing to do.
So I see that Claire's got her hand up. I've been sitting on a question, and I think now is my chance to ask it. In part, it's bringing two of the papers in conversation. So your March 22 paper, Christian, talks about a positive effect or a negative effect of the anthropause, and kind of in a multi-species or more than human idiom. You know, often the question is, you know, cui bono, or who benefits in a given milieu when something shifts, rather than trying to think about that environment as an abstracted thing. So cui bono in terms of an individual animal or a species, and I think the paper that Adam led really does a good job of differentiating the different kinds of animals that might have experienced the anthropause. So animals directly dependent on human care, synurbic or commensal animals, and feral or wild animals that flourished in the absence of humans. So I'm wondering how to think through, you know, it's like, rather than thinking about the environment as this sort of homogeneous entity, how to think through the complexities of the more than human or multi-species experiences and the anthropause.
Oh, thanks for that brilliant question. I'll just go in really quickly, particularly on the different kinds of animals. And you mentioned there synurbic and commensal species. We were struck by something Man Barrower said about the pandemic as a breakdown in the commensal city, and it kind of highlighted, as you said, all of these different relationships that all these different species that were directly dependent on human presence and activity. One case, there was this kind of memified version of nature as healing that we've spoken about already, that kind of had this idea that no matter what, this was good for nature en masse. But then by looking at the specifics of it, we found with certain commensal species, lockdown wasn't a good thing at all. For example, the famous cited case in the UK was that of red kites, which are raptors that are directly dependent on carrion from roadkill, and you often see them circulating above motorways, and they were threatened by the absence of one of their major food sources and things like that. Yeah. So that was one example of that we thought was very interesting, that by looking at different species, you could challenge this notion that it was good for nature in general.
I guess the other one was around surveillance, wasn't it? That the reconfiguration of where people went to watch animals, which, I mean, Christian, you're very involved in raptor conservation, and you know, the presence or absence of people on the land is key for preventing illegal killings of birds. And again, that was sort of shifted in different ways, both by the sort of new movements of people out into landscapes, but also restrictions on where people could go. So that was another dimension that was reconfigured.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that is coming out really clearly in the empirical evidence now. work conducted by another major research consortium called the Pan Environment Working Group, led by Amanda Bates and Richard Primack and Carlos Duarte. They published a paper that emphasizes that humans are both threats and custodians of the environment. And so it's exactly this context dependence and the complexity you mentioned, Evan, that they find in the empirical evidence. So they collated a large number of quantitative case studies from all around the world. This is not just animal tracking, it's all sorts of environmental responses to lockdowns. And they find it's perhaps unsurprisingly a mixed bag. So in some cases, there are positive effects, and others there are negatives. When you think about species, there are winners and there are losers. And I think the challenge for us is going forward to make sense of that complexity, to understand the context dependence, because only if we achieve that can we make effective conservation recommendations. It is not a one size fits all. You know, we need that nuance. And certainly these initial headlines of nature rebounding, nature healing, they are not borne out by the evidence. And this is also important because it goes back to, you know, some of these initial worries that, you know, scientists will recommend that humans should stay in some state of permanent lockdown. Absolutely not. That cannot be a viable proposition. The challenge here is to develop an informed, empirically evidence-informed vision for forging sustainable coexistence. So of course we will return to the environment as we emerge from the pandemic, but perhaps we can find innovative ways of doing so that causes less impact on the natural world. And that is the challenge.
Clara, go ahead. Sorry to cut off your question earlier.
No, not at all. And this question is maybe not totally fair, because I understand that you're studying mobility spatially, but since a lot of the research you're looking at online spaces and virtual communication as sort of like the alternate to that, I just wondered your perspectives. I'm interested in climate change, and so thinking about the energy and carbon impact of increased internet infrastructure and like the movement of our lives into increasingly virtual spaces in environmental terms. And I just wondered if that was something you could speak to or have recommendations for like global research and in that way, thinking about the Anthropause from maybe that perspective.
And I might piggyback too. I remember those early pictures of kind of the carbon emissions of China shrinking during the lockdowns, and I just haven't heard any you know, new info about that. So yeah, it'd be great if you could tackle the carbon emissions question, both from the perspective that Clara importantly brought up in terms of the digital carbon footprint, but also the mobility carbon footprint.
Yeah, this was something raised by reviewers of this paper as well, and it's the focus of some work in a different direction. Yeah, it's a tricky one, because in affirming any kind of eco-positive digital space or benefits of, you know, online digital nature experiences and encounters, you have to also, you know, forefront the supply chains that lead to these encounters in the first place, that often involve very poor working conditions and labor conditions. They are, you know, bound up in global circuits of capital and outsourced exploitative labor and long-lasting toxic materials and pollutants that are designed with predetermined shelf lives and stuff like this. So yeah, the digital technologies, it's a tough one because of this project that we're kind of working on digital ecologies. It's not to say that they're a panacea for all ills, and it's just to kind of, you know, encourage people to take more of an interest in empirically in how people actually experience those things instead of just writing them off from the start. But yeah, so there is now a small section in the conclusion which addresses that. Says, okay, well, yeah, while there have been these positives, you know, how do we contextualize those positives against all of the negatives that I just mentioned? I'm not really, off the top of my head, I'm not aware of studies that have specifically tracked the carbon outputs of increased digital usage during the Anthropause, but I'm sure maybe someone else is aware of those. I'm not sure.
Adam, Jamie, Christian, any thoughts?
I would love to know the answer to this, Clara. If you know of any studies that looked at that, I think it would be extremely important to synthesize this with evidence on the reduction in carbon emissions as a result of reduced travel activity. I mean, I think it's clear that if there is less travel activity, carbon emissions will fall. But the argument you're putting forward is that some of that will be offset by increased digital activity, and the question is just by what percentage. And I don't have a good intuition for that. I think that's an empirical matter, and I would love to know whether people have quantified these effects. One thing I want to mention in response to this comment is that in my field, people really started thinking about or started using systems thinking, Earth systems thinking. It's a realization that all these things are interconnected. You may look at one metric that is changed and you track that change, but well, there are cascading effects of those changes, and they are interconnected. And I think this is a good example of how these different systems are interconnected. So one aspect of human activity may change and may have benefits. Another one may show a correlated response, which have negative consequences. And that is the big challenge, to paint the really big picture of all these interconnections.
Thanks. Adam, Jamie, any final thoughts? All right.
I guess just the big push that we had was to try and rescue a space for digital encounters in that sort of romantic apocalyptic idea that the last child in the woods is being dragged out of the woods by their tablet, and there's no way back to having kind of faithful encounters with nature, that there is a space for the digital in the future in that kind of ecology.
All right, I think that's a great note to wrap on. Clara, do you have any final thoughts?
Just that I'll definitely email you if I find anything good. And also, I put in the chat, I do think that this kind of research is really useful for developing more nuanced and inclusive understandings of whose domain the digital might be in a way that impacts its infrastructural futures. Also, I'm thinking about like the bird group in contrast to like cryptocurrency or something like that, because I don't think it's a given how the internet develops or the kinds of resources and impact that it makes either. So just to say, I think it's, there's no, not to be overly pessimistic, you know, that this work is part of that solution also, maybe.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Claire. That was a really good insight to end on. So with that, thank you all for coming for the 100th multi-species coronavirus reading group, and look forward to seeing you hopefully in real life, but maybe in a Zoom room sometime soon.
Thanks
Thanks
everybody.
for having us. Really
Thank you so much for the feedback.
Thanks for coming back.
Thanks all.
Take care.
Bye everybody.